Hi guys, welcome to the final video about language learning stressors. This also marks the end of the section about psychological issues in the How to Immerse in a Foreign Language series. I know that this section of the series has been a really long one, but honestly, that's because I really feel that the techniques and methodologies are honestly secondary to the primary objective of becoming a disciplined person that can carry out their long-term goals. So I'm sure I've probably been a bit long-winded in this section of the series, but I sincerely hope that I was at least able to help some of you. In the next video in this series, we'll be talking about reading, and in the video after that, we'll be talking about studying flashcards and SRS. So make sure to subscribe if you're interested in that type of content. And the final video in the series will be about outputting. I'm also very happy to announce that the Migaku website is now in development and will be coming soon. The site seeks to be a one-stop hub for immersion learners, but I don't want to spoil what it will contain and ruin all the fun. So make sure you're subscribed if you don't want to miss its release. In today's video, we will be talking about fitting immersion learning into our individual schedules and life circumstances. And then we will be talking about a strategy that you might use to help you answer the question of whether language learning is really an appropriate goal for you or not. I've met people for whom language learning was simply not an appropriate goal that aligned strongly enough with their interests. And it took them a pretty long time and quite a bit of psychological turmoil until they were able to admit it to themselves and find a long-term goal that aligned better with their own interests. So if you find yourself doubting whether language learning is an appropriate goal for you or not, I sincerely hope that the last section of this video might help you answer that question. Setting goals that are appropriate for your individual life circumstances is by far the best way of dealing with psychological stress. I personally have not always been the best at this, and actually it's something that someone should make a point to regularly reconsider because our life circumstances are rather fluid and in constant flux. It's pretty easy to forget to adjust your daily goals again even after your life circumstances have changed, which is something I've fallen victim to on multiple occasions, and realistically am not confident that I won't stumble across this issue again. The importance of setting appropriate daily goals can honestly not be overstated, because remember, at the end of the day, your long-term goals are not even really a tangible concept from the perspective of your daily life. We can use our long-term goals as principles to guide our daily goals, but we have to keep in mind that we will never directly engage with those long-term goals in a tangible way. We are instead only engaging with those activities that are in front of us on a daily basis, and that will lead us to an eventual result, which hopefully is the accomplishment of our long-term goal. But an important lesson that I've learned is to focus at most a week or two ahead when thinking about your goals. I believe that this sort of perspective will put you in the headspace that you will need to, over the months and years, pursue your goal and acquire your target language. Besides this general shift in mentality, I want to talk about two of the major aspects that I take into consideration when setting my daily goals. First, I try to keep in mind when and for how long I'm scheduling my daily goals and whether I can really afford the sacrifice and opportunity costs associated with pursuing that goal in my life. Now, we all likely will find slightly different ways to fit language learning into our lives, but I have a certain process that I go through when fitting language learning, or any other goal for that matter, into my own life. And perhaps the primary factor that I try to keep in mind when I'm scheduling an activity related to my goal is how I usually feel at around the time that I've scheduled that activity. A simplified view of my daily schedule basically looks like this. I wake up, I try to do some form of exercise, however meager, and that's also when I try to do my family or household related errands or tasks. And finally, I usually have a bit of leisure time before starting to work. The total allotted time for this exercise, errands, and leisure time is 2 hours. Then my work day goes for around 10 hours, including breaks and eating. And finally, at the end of the day, I like to have 2 to 3 hours of leisure time. Unless work runs over and eats into my leisure time, which of course is not my favorite thing. My day off is Sunday, and on Saturdays I try to stop working a few hours early when I can and have some extra leisure time with my family or friends. So now we have a general outline of when I do things, but how do I feel during those times? I know that the first hour or two when I first get up are not my best times intellectually, which is why my schedule only has more minor tasks during that time. I also know that after I eat, I get pretty tired, so I often take a short break after eating and do some easier work during that time or simply a leisure activity. Lastly, I know that after I've finished working at the end of the day, I'm usually between very tired and outright exhausted, and I'm certainly not in the best headspace to engage in goal-related activities that require a lot of discipline during that time. So thinking about my schedule overall, it's actually going to be very difficult to find the time and energy to fit more goal-related activities into it. Recently, Migaku has just reached 500 patrons, and the community voted that I should work to improve my Japanese and acquire pitch accent. So in order to work on these goals, I will be starting to reintroduce language learning into my life next year. I will later make a video about my exact plan and the techniques that I will be using, but what I can say now basically is that I won't be using the SRS too much in the long term, but I do plan to use it pretty heavily in the beginning. My plan is to use it to learn all the pitch accent rules and the accents of the words that comprise from 90 to 95% of spoken Japanese. But I also know that I have no interest in taking on a 7-day-per-week SRS schedule. I've been there and I know that it has led me to get behind on my reviews on many occasions and overall start feeling negatively towards my SRS study. So my plan is to use the Migaku vacation add-on and only study in the SRS 4 to 5 days a week. I also know that the SRS study itself, along with the pitch training I plan to do, will likely be the part of the process that will require the most discipline for me. Also, as far as pitch training goes, I will be using and releasing a new software project that should help substantially with it sometime next year. So make sure you're subscribed and look out for it if you're also interested in improving your Japanese pitch and pronunciation. So anyways, given that SRS study and pitch training will require the most discipline for me, I feel that if I'm going to be fair to my goal, I will need to reduce my work hours 4 to 5 days a week by an hour or so, or I am unlikely to have the energy required to carry out this task consistently. I also know that I will need to begin consistently reading in Japanese again if I am to make marked improvements over the course of a year. Now, during my free time at night, I currently generally play video games or watch shows with my wife if I'm not working overtime. So it's actually going to be quite a sacrifice to ask myself to switch either of those activities to reading. I genuinely like reading, but oftentimes during work, I already do a great deal of reading about programming related topics. And reading is generally an activity that requires more discipline than either playing video games or watching shows, and is less rewarding from a dopamine perspective as well. And considering that after writing, filming videos, editing, and programming all day that I generally don't have a great deal of energy left, I know that scheduling another discipline-based activity like reading after my work as a must-do activity is going to be rather risky, because I feel that I and most people need a sufficient amount of leisure time without any scheduled must-do activities, or they will likely run into trouble and start burning out. I will be making a video about the importance of this type of leisure time in my upcoming productivity series. I haven't seen many people talk about this at all, but I feel very strongly that one must maintain an acceptable ratio of leisure time to work time in order to find a sustainable schedule. But anyways, taking all that into account for reading, I only plan to do it for about 20 minutes each night and hopefully scale that up to around 30 minutes over time. If I find that I can be consistent at night after work, then I'm thinking about moving my reading to before work instead. And of course, I will also have to do some listening immersion. So I'm planning to aim for around 30 minutes to an hour a day at the beginning and see where that gets me. I somewhat regularly watch shows at night and sometimes in Japanese as it is. So I predict that just being more methodical and making sure that I watch something and that it's in Japanese shouldn't be too difficult. Watching shows in Japanese for me is already a really comfortable and generally pleasing activity, although at times I do have some trouble finding content that I find truly engaging. But even considering that, I do think that listening immersion is going to be the easiest part of reintroducing language learning into my own life. I'm also thinking about doing a little bit of extra listening immersion during the day when I'm taking small breaks from work that I won't be counting towards my daily goals as well. So why did I tell you all of this? Well, that's because I want to illustrate to you how I think about a goal in relation to my schedule. My plan is to immerse and study Japanese for around 1 hour and 30 minutes to 2 hours on those days that I study in the SRS, and about 30 minutes less than that on the days that I don't. I'll be aiming to do SRS study for 4 to 5 days a week, reading hopefully 5 to 6 days a week, and do listening immersion for 6 to 7 days a week. You will notice that I'm giving myself a target range rather than an exact target. You may also notice that even though I generally have 4 to 5 hours of unoccupied time each day, that I am not choosing to simply stick all of my study time during that free time. That's because I'm taking into account how I feel during and about my free time. I'm sure that if I were to stick all of my study time during my free time and didn't reduce my work hours at all, then I could probably successfully implement my studies for a period of time. But I can say with confidence that there's almost certainly no chance that I would be able to consistently do so over the course of a year while continuing to execute my already very busy schedule. The study schedule that I am planning to implement is very much tentative. I plan to do my best to try to follow it, but more importantly, to try to pay attention to how I feel while I'm trying to follow it. And of course, paying attention to whether I'm actually able to complete my daily goals. If I find that I am not able to do so, I will simply reduce those goals until I find something sustainable. My goal is not to tell myself how much language learning I want to do each week. My goal is to reality test how much language learning I can actually do within the context of my schedule. I feel it's very important to have a clear priority order as to how you'll be spending your time. I actually recommend that you even write it down. Right now, my main priority is and has to be working on Migaku. And while I do feel that working on Japanese will be of benefit to Migaku as well, I'm already taking that into account with my plan to reduce my working time by an hour on some days to instead study Japanese. But I'm also making a clear value judgment that at most an hour can be reduced from my working time, and only on some days, based proportionally on my own priorities. Of course, there are other priorities such as time with my friends and family as well. So at the end of the day, if after reality testing my plan, I find that I cannot consistently execute it, then there are only a few choices left to me. Some of them being, 1, feel really bad about not being able to anywhere near consistently complete my daily goals, but still try to complete them. Even though reality testing suggests that these goals are simply not appropriate for my own individual life circumstances and current schedule, or perhaps even that my ability to execute further discipline to complete them is just lacking. I could still maybe try in vain to complete them, but from my experience, that just leads to a sort of negative spiral of negative feelings towards those goals. 2, I could raise the priority of language learning in my life and shift around my schedule a bit to allow more time for it. But as I just explained, that's not really an option for me right now, so I won't be doing that. 3, I could lower my goals in accordance with what reality testing is showing me. And I could just accept that my initial formulation simply isn't appropriate for my current life circumstances. First, I could lower my goals until they become easily sustainable, and then from there, I can try to raise them until I find a good balance between challenge and sustainability. Of these choices, only the third one makes any shred of sense to me. Perhaps in the future, my individual life circumstances will change, which will allow more time for language learning, or maybe even I will choose to prioritize language learning more at some point. But at the end of the day, the result that you get from reality testing your daily goals should be respected. You can of course work towards increasing your daily goals over time, but respect where you are now and slowly work towards that. Okay guys, so last but not least, you've heard me talk about some of the psychological barriers that people will almost surely run into on their language learning journey. And you've also heard me talk about some of the strategies one might use to overcome or at least mitigate those barriers. I lastly want to talk about the big question, and that's ultimately whether you really want to learn your target language or not, and how you might go about finding the answer to that question if you still just aren't sure. And now guys, let me be clear, what I'm talking about here is not whether you want to become able to speak or be literate in your target language. Rather, what I'm talking about is whether you want to actually do what you will need to do and what you will need to put yourself through in order to achieve those goals. And as you know, many people will try language learning and just give up, claiming that it simply just wasn't for them. But before you do the same thing, please at least try the steps that I'm going to tell you about. Now, the steps aren't greatly refined, nor can I say without doubt that they will lead you to the correct answer. But they are the sort of steps that I have inadvertently used on quite a number of occasions in order to help myself decide whether I wanted to continue with a goal or shelve it, even if only temporarily. The fact is, I actually started learning programming on 2 occasions before succeeding with the third while I was living abroad over the past 10 years. But even on those first 2 occasions, I actually stuck with it and studied hard for 3 or 4 months both times. But ultimately, even though I really liked programming and thought it was a really good goal for me and knew that eventually I was going to commit myself to it, I simply didn't want to do it at that time under those life circumstances in the context of my life abroad, when my inherent interests in language learning were at the time so much higher than my interest in programming. Besides programming, I've also dabbled in multiple foreign languages before, basically with just the intent of finding out more about their structure. But I once did study Arabic for a few months with the intent of continuing it in the long term. And even though Arabic is a completely fascinating language to me that I would like to properly tackle one day, when I previously studied it, it simply wasn't the right time for it. Even besides programming, I also studied for the top level of the Japanese Kanken Kanji test for a period of time, and also taught myself how to write over 5,000 Chinese Hanzi too. I eventually shelved those projects as well, because I realized that they ultimately didn't really align with what I wanted in my life. So I'm certainly experienced with trying out long-term goals for a considerable amount of time and finding out whether they really fit my life or not. So the steps that I'm going to lay out now are based on my experiences setting appropriate goals and misaligned goals. Firstly, I don't want to repeat the entirety of what I've already said in other videos, but I would like to just summarize my perspective on language learning. Anyone who is able to learn and is currently able to understand their native language is capable of learning their target language. Immersion learning will require considerable discipline for the vast majority of people who pursue it. No matter your level of inherent interest in your language learning goal, it is my belief that at many times in the process you will have to override your desire to not immerse or study. If your intuition is telling you to quit language learning because it just isn't for you, but you also don't have a history of working hard towards other long-term goals, then you shouldn't trust your intuition. All long-term goals are psychologically challenging, and in language learning in particular, all major challenges you will face are likely to be predominantly psychological in nature. Okay guys, so with all of this in mind, if you haven't worked hard towards a long-term goal before and aren't sure if language learning is for you, then please try to complete these steps and ask yourself again whether it is or not. The point of these steps is to help you understand that you're going to need both inherent interest and discipline in order to continue moving towards your language learning goals. So let's go over those steps now. It's going to be a 4-week process. For the first week, you should attempt to spend 40 minutes watching content in your target language with native language subtitles. If you don't have a particular type of content that you already know that you like in your target language, then try to sample as wide of a variety of content as you can during this time. The idea is to try to begin to familiarize yourself with what type of content exists in your target language. If you're also interested in moving to a country where your target language is spoken, then try to find and watch some videos of people who actually live there, both expats and natives. And also watch some news about the country in your native language if you can find some. Your goal is simply to understand a bit more about the reality of living there. Although of course your understanding will still be rudimentary and you won't really understand the country that well until you go and live there for at least a few years yourself. But be careful, because sometimes you can kind of get the wrong impression about a place, as I did when I moved from China to Brazil, for example. During the second week, try to also pick up a beginner's introduction book to the language and just browse through it on occasion. Feel free to close it when you've really had enough, but try to push yourself to read a bit more about the language when you can. I also feel very strongly that SRS flashcards greatly expedite the learning process, so if you're planning to use them in your immersion learning, then I feel that it's during the second week that you should begin using them. So I would just say download a pre-made deck, and hopefully the Migaku decks are out by the time you're watching this video, so I would just say go ahead and use those. And go ahead and try to study 10 new cards per day and be consistent about doing your reviews. They can be sentence or vocabulary cards. You can go ahead and choose your preference. Also, I suggest that most people use the Migaku vacation add-on and set their SRS schedule to only 5 days per week. As far as watching goes during the second week, I recommend to watch 20 minutes with native language subtitles and 20 minutes with target language subtitles. When immersing with target language subtitles, I recommend you use the Immerse with Migaku browser extension and go ahead and look up any words that catch your attention. But also make sure to watch my how to immerse in a target language listening video at this time and learn how to cycle through the different levels of attention when watching. Also, if the Migaku website has already been published by the time you're watching this video, you can find comprehensive information about how to read and listen to your target language on the website. So make sure to check the site out. The link will be in the description once it's been published. Moving on to the third week, you should continue reading the introduction book and studying in the SRS. At this point, I would also recommend, even if you predominantly like a particular type of content in your target language and have been predominantly using it to immerse thus far, that during the third week, you begin to sample a wide variety of content. Because unfortunately, what can often happen when people just have a very strong interest in one particular content type is that over time they can actually lose that interest and then find that they don't necessarily enjoy much other content in their target language and then end up feeling kind of lost. So I highly recommend that you do a survey of the content in your target language. I think that during the third week, you should also try to increase your immersion time maybe to at least an hour a day or something, if at all possible. And to include just a bit of time, maybe 10 or 15 minutes or so, just listening to the raw language itself. The reason for this is because I feel that it's very important to start building that understanding that you won't always be understanding everything you're consuming in your target language. A key ability that you will need to succeed in immersion learning is to understand that it's okay not to understand everything. And it's through consistent exposure that you will begin to and ultimately will acquire your target language. The suggestion to also increase the immersion time, if at all possible, is just to suggest to you that this is a long-term goal that will require a lot from you. I don't want to sugarcoat it, particularly if you want to challenge a language that is quite different from your native language. It's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of time to reach the upper levels of fluency. So I feel that it's important to already start to try to test your limits and see how much discipline you actually have when it comes to carrying out your immersion. During the fourth and final week, I mostly just recommend that you continue doing what you have been doing during the third week. But I also recommend that you start looking into and reading through perhaps some of the popular websites or even flipping through a book if you'd like in your target language. And another thing you can do is find out what apps are popular for native speakers of your target language and go ahead and download them and try them out. Another thing that might also be interesting to do during this week is to go ahead and find a native speaker of your target language that speaks your native language and go ahead and talk to them a little bit. You can ask them about whatever you'd like, but if you're interested in eventually moving abroad to a country where your target language is spoken, then I suggest you ask them a little bit about what it's like to live there. And that pretty much sums up what I think you should try to do. And let me be clear, guys, I'm not saying that this is the methodology that Migaku recommends overall. Rather, this is just a way for someone who's having trouble deciding whether they want to even do immersion learning to kind of get a taste for what it entails and what it's going to really require of them. Once you've found out whether language learning is for you or not, then you would start following the recommended methodologies that we suggest at Migaku from the beginning. So anyways, what happens when you reach the end of these 4 weeks? The first thing you should ask yourself is, were you able to do it? Were you able to be consistent? I know that these activities that I'm suggesting will require considerable discipline from the vast majority of people. Well, if you weren't able to do it and haven't previously completed any other long-term goals, I would likely recommend that before you even consider pursuing immersion learning or any other long-term goal for that matter, that you spend some time learning and thinking about discipline and productivity strategies. Because I feel that unfortunately, you can't really answer the question of whether you want to learn your target language or not. I feel that the prerequisite to accurately being able to answer that question is feeling that you actually have the capacity to carry out that goal. For example, it makes very little sense for me to ask myself if I want to fly a plane to Spain right now. I would need an airplane and the ability to fly that airplane, which I don't have either of. I don't have the ability to fly an airplane to Spain right now, so I can't actually answer the question of whether I would want to. Perhaps if I was capable of it, I could answer the question, yes, I would like to fly an airplane to Spain, why not? Maybe I can go there and have a nice vacation, for example. Okay, enough silliness, but guys, I'm pretty serious here. If you don't have the ability to know what it's going to take from you, if you haven't experienced what it's actually going to take in order to learn your target language, then you don't know how to answer that question. You don't know what it means to even ask yourself, do I want to learn this language? Because first you have to put yourself through the process for some time and understand what it's actually going to take. Then you can answer that question. Anyways, let's talk about the people who were able to arrive at the end of the 4th week and were largely able to complete all of the tasks in those steps. How should they go about answering this question? Well, first of all, job well done. You should have a pretty good understanding of what it's going to take to succeed in immersion learning. So I don't feel there's any reason you need to look to me for help in answering this question anymore. You're in a fantastic position to go ahead and ask yourself, do I really want to learn this language? Well, that's it for today, guys. I really hope that some of you found this video helpful. I really would have loved to have this sort of content available when I was starting on my journey. In the next video in this series, we will talk about reading, and particularly reading at different levels of attention. And in the video after that about studying flashcards in SRS, I will also go over and introduce tools such as the Migaku Vacation add-on, which I feel will truly help to alleviate a huge part of the stress of using an SRS. If you're interested in helping us decide the direction of Migaku, joining our official Migaku Discord community, and gaining access to early releases of Migaku software projects and other bonus content, then please consider supporting Migaku on Patreon. As always, thank you so much to all my patrons. I literally couldn't do it without your support. And of course, a special shout out to the $1 leech tier. The sheer bliss of having the support of the leeches is at times overwhelming. Thank you so much. If you need support with an issue you're having or would like to join the Immerse with Migaku Reddit community, you can find those links in the description below. If you would like a chance to win free special VIP access to the official Migaku Discord community and Migaku software projects, then please subscribe to this channel and leave a like and comment on the video below. If you can, try to include your Twitter handle or Discord ID in your comment so that it's easier for me to contact you and let you know if you've won. At the end of every month, I choose 15 people to get a free behind the scenes look at the community we're building, and that number will be increasing as new Patreon milestones are reached. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you found some value in today's video. See ya.